Billy Tyne hustles to find a replacement in town and finally reaches David Sullivan, who agrees to make the trip.
Billy Tyne had coaxed him into going on the boat for the trip, and he went. I wish I would have known more, because I know it was a bad time of year to go from my other buddies that swordfish for years.
At the Crow's Nest, there's a general uneasiness that seems to hang over the bar. The crew keeps ordering drinks, and no one seems anxious to leave and board the boat.
I don't know. It was a very weird feeling. It was a weird feeling in the air. I mean, I don't know what it sounds like, but it's the truth. It was strange, and everybody knew it, and everybody felt it.
With everyone accounted for, Captain Billy Tyne orders a final round of drinks. Shortly after, the crew slowly makes its way out of the bar and down to the dock in their boat, the Gale. Bobby Shatford and Chris drive over, alone in her car.
We wanted to have those last moments together. So we drove over about 50 feet and pulled down this dirt yard thing where the boat's right here. David Sullivan stopped by the car and he said, "Are you gonna be all right?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, "Okay." He said, "Take care of yourself." And he said, he told me he would take care of him. He said, "I'll take care of him, of Bobby."
At this point, everyone's on the boat, and they just need Bobby Shatford.
He said, "I'll always love you." He was weeping, crying, not heavily, but you know, sad. And he got out and he came around the car and gave me his sunglasses and said he didn't need them out there, and kissed me goodbye again and walked towards the boat and never looked back.
And he won't wave goodbye because he feels it's bad luck. They've decided it's bad luck to wave goodbye in a situation like that.
Perhaps he should have.
The long months away from home at sea had destroyed Billy Tyne's marriage, but his family is always on his mind. Before leaving the Crow's Nest, he makes one last call to his ex-wife in Florida with his usual message.
"I love you," which was always what he said to me. "Tell the kids I love them and I miss them, and I'll see them soon."
In the late afternoon of September 20th, Tyne pilots out of Gloucester Harbor. The air is crisp, calm, and clear as the Gale sets out for the Grand Banks, about 400 miles off the tip of Newfoundland. On the way out, they pass Sable Island, an infamous spot to Gloucester fishermen.
Sable Island is known by fishermen to be the graveyard of the North Atlantic. It has very dangerous shoals on two sides of it. A lot of ships have gone down in that area. They have a chart, a little map that shows all the shipwrecks in that area, and it's astounding the number of boats that have been in trouble there.
After 3 weeks fishing at the Grand Banks, Billy Tyne was worried. There were only 20,000 pounds of fish in the hold, half the amount he needed to clear expenses and provide decent paychecks to his crew. He makes a fateful decision to go farther east, out to an area known as the Flemish Cap. But this will add an extra week onto the trip.
He didn't have enough fish to go in. This is his last chance to make a paycheck for the season. In my opinion, he did the right thing by staying. I would have done the same thing.
And he hit pretty big immediately, which immediately sort of pumps the crew up, and they're working very hard. They know the end is near. They're going to be going home very soon. It's like hitting a lottery ticket.
But the good luck they've had all week is suddenly in jeopardy. The ice machine breaks down. All their hard work and profits will melt away if they don't get the fish back quickly while the catch is still fresh.
And the boats that come in first hit the highest prices. And the boats that come in at the tail end of it, the market can fall in half easily.
The crew has been away for a month, and now they have one more reason to want to get home. But the trip back home will take at least another week. When Billy Tyne turns the Gale towards Gloucester, he has no idea of the weather that is developing thousands of miles away. 3 separate storm systems are evolving, and in a couple of days they will collide head-on, directly in the path of the Gale.
It wasn't really, I believe, until the weekend that we had a sure fix that this system, 1, was going to evolve, and 2, was going to become this monster. By that time, it was too late.
There's a hurricane coming up from Bermuda, and there's a low-pressure system coming from the Great Lakes. No one realized the two would converge and make an enormous storm. And they converged basically right over Billy Tyne.
It's the forecast you least like to hear when you're on a boat. It's intensifying, and it's slowing down, and it's coming towards you.
They can't move fast enough to get out of what's coming at them. And that system was just too large and growing too rapidly for them to even have an opportunity.
The Andrea Gale is now headed into the most powerful and ferocious storm to hit the northeast coast in at least 100 years. It's October 25th, 1991. Spirits are running high aboard the Andrea Gale as Billy Tyne and his 5-man crew begin their return trip to Gloucester Harbor. They have reason to celebrate. In their final week of fishing, they had caught several thousand pounds of swordfish, ensuring a good paycheck for each crew member. But in order to find the fish, Billy Tyne had traveled 1,600 miles out to sea, halfway across the Atlantic. Now it would take a week for the Andrea Gale to make the trip back home. 2 days into that return trip, on October 27th, Billy notified the Coast Guard, as required, that he was approaching Canadian waters. That same day in Maryland, meteorologists at the National Marine Prediction Center were starting to become concerned about 3 separate storm systems that looked like they might collide in the North Atlantic. If so, it could create a storm unlike anything they had ever seen before.
So we have 3 systems here. We have the remnants of Grace merging with this extratropical storm, and then it's retrograding to the west, and then this high-pressure system over Canada, providing a pressure gradient that increased the winds and the waves over the North Atlantic. All these came together to produce this massive surface cyclone.
On the night of October 28th, Billy Tyne contacts the rest of the sword fishing fleet after they have all received ominous weather reports earlier that afternoon. Being the farthest boat west, the Andrea Gale is already experiencing rough seas and high winds.
Whatever's coming at you, you're going to have to face. There's no way to tuck into port and let it pass. And even if there was, if you ran into port every time there was some bad weather on the horizon, you wouldn't get any fishing done. And so they had reports of this big storm coming.
I knew that there was bad weather coming. Billy Tyne called and said, it just went from 0 to 50 in a matter of minutes. It's going to be very bad, and I hope you're not planning on fishing tonight.
The last thing that he said was, well, she's coming on, boys, and she's coming on strong. And that was like letting the rest of the fleet know that the weather had gotten to him, and you know, that it was pretty bad.
Billy Tyne radioed that at around 6 o'clock, right after they got hit by the storm, he said that it was, he said that the change was just from night and day. They went from normal weather to a hellish storm in practically minutes.
As the storm quickly intensifies, the ocean becomes a cauldron of churning water. The Andrea Gale is headed dead center into the storm. And by midnight, the waves are measuring an astonishing 70 to 100 feet, with winds at 90 knots. That's 104 miles per hour.
When you're down in the trough, it's a total eclipse of the sun. I mean, it's dark. There's walls of water on either side of you. When you're up on top, it's like being on top of a mountain.
One survivor of the storm, Judith Reeves, comes closest to experiencing what the crew of the Andrea Gale was going through. Judith, a Canadian fisheries observer, was aboard a Japanese sword fishing boat, the Aishin Maru. The Aishin Maru was twice the size of the Andrea Gale, but it still took a brutal beating from the storm.
The whole vessel would get slapped down at 90 to 100 degrees, 120 degrees, and then it would hesitate before it would pop back up again. In those hesitations, you're counting every millisecond.
A huge wave smashes the windows of the Aishin Maru's bridge, and water begins pouring into the boat.
All the electric wires were frying and snapping, and there was electrical fire as well. You could see that kind of lightning bolt thing happening, zigzagging. I knew then that the ocean itself was much stronger than I'd ever encountered, and that we were very vulnerable.
They lost their steerage, so now they're dead in the water. And of course, if you're dead in the water and you turn broadside to seas like that, you can be rolled over very easily.
Judith Reeves is the only person on board the Aishin Maru whose English is good enough to make the Mayday call to the Coast Guard. When she relays the captain's message, she realizes just how dangerous their situation is.
We are helpless and drifting. Please render all assistance.
If you have breaking 70-foot waves, those are waves that can break a boat in half. Those are waves that can flip a boat over, and these are steel-hulled boats. So if it flips over, it sinks.
On the Aishin Maru, in the midst of fear and chaos, Reeves is amazed to receive a satellite phone call from a Canadian radio correspondent.
Judith Reeves, aboard the ship Aishin Maru 78, now in grave danger off Sable, is on the line with C-100's Rick Howe.
Miss Reeves, how rough is it out there?
We lost all our instrumentation in the wheelhouse. That includes all radios, all radar, navigation, and finally, just about 2 hours ago, we lost helm, which means we have no, we're drifting right now.
Are you in any danger at all?
No, we're in danger, definitely. We're in danger. Everything is battened down, hatched, and practically nailed shut. So if she goes over, there's no way anybody's going to get out over.
When the Coast Guard arrives, they determine that conditions are too dangerous to attempt a rescue and that the crew is safer riding it out on the Aishin Maru.
You know, those boats are about 180 feet long, and so you start thinking to yourself, well, if they're in weather like that, what's that going to be like when it gets to us? You know, so that's the main thing you're fearful of, is the unknown, and is it going to get much worse? If it gets much worse, you know, will we be able to survive?
For 12 hours, the Aishin Maru is tossed around in violent seas. Eventually, the Japanese crew manages to rig a cable to the rudder, and with their bare hands, they are able to steer the boat to Halifax Harbor. On October 29th, the storm reaches its full force. More and more ships are putting out Mayday calls, but no call has been received from the Andrea Gale.
The Andrea Gale is not responding to radio calls. And immediately people start thinking, well, she lost her antennas, and she lost her electronics, maybe she's in trouble, but she's all right. I mean, a lot of boats get beat up out there and wind up fine. So it actually is more likely that they lost their antennas. Not that many boats sink.
For the Coast Guard, responding to Mayday calls, the next 48 hours will be unforgettable, testing all their training, courage, and stamina, and bringing themselves to the brink of mortal danger. It's Halloween Eve, October 30th, 1991, and the East Coast is taking a beating from a ghoulish storm that has no name. Part hurricane, part nor'easter, it tears through coastal areas, severing buildings from their foundations. Some watch helplessly as their homes slide into the ocean. The storm covers 1,500 miles, 3 times the size of the average hurricane. It stretches from New England to Florida, creating havoc up and down the East Coast. Author Sebastian Younger was living in Gloucester, Massachusetts at the time.
My girlfriend and I rushed out to the back shore that faces the open ocean and just saw this incredible spectacle of these 30-foot waves marching in, just enormous seas, and just houses were just getting ripped apart.
As frightening as it was on shore, it was 10 times more terrifying at sea, especially if you were aboard a sailboat being tossed around like a cork in those 30 to 40-foot waves. That's where Ray Leonard found himself aboard his 32-foot sailboat, the Satori. On October 26, Leonard had left Portsmouth, New Hampshire, on his way to Bermuda for the winter season. He had taken on 2 women crew members, Karen Stimson and Sue Bylander from Portland, Maine. They signed on as a crew for a free trip to Bermuda.
They sort of continued on despite sort of increasingly bad weather forecasts. The captain was very experienced and had been through some pretty bad weather. The Satori was a very rugged boat, and I think he felt that, there's a little bit like Billy Tyne did, there's nothing that I can't take.
Approximately 100 miles off Cape Cod, the Satori encounters severe weather conditions.
As the forecasters became aware that this was going to be a dangerous storm that would affect a large area of the Atlantic, they began issuing warnings that the storm would grow to dangerous proportions by the 29th, and that there would be waves associated with this storm 50 feet, with individual waves having the potential of growing to 100 feet.
I said, yes, I said, this is getting to be really quite rough, But I still had great faith in the integrity of the boat. I didn't think for a moment that she wouldn't make it.
But as the winds continue to build and waves grow higher and more chaotic, the crew members, Karen and Sue, insist they issue a mayday call.
They were sure we would sink any minute, but I said, no, it's impossible. There's no way the boat can go down because she's so well built.
Finally, Ray allows his terrified crew to use the radio to contact a ship in the area. That ship takes their message to be a mayday call and relays it to the Coast Guard. Coast Guard Command deploys the 1,600-ton cutter, the Tamaroa, to rescue the Satori and its crew. Coast Guard crewmen from that mission shot footage of the rescue.
We were told that there's a sailing vessel in trouble. It had almost rolled over in the middle of the night, damaged the rigging. People on board were scared and needed some help and wanted to get off.
The situation just got worse and worse. They lost their life raft, they lost one of their radios, they didn't know how much fuel they had left. The sea was, they weren't even sailing, the sea was just knocking them around.
They were not only pitching from forward to aft, but they were rolling back and forth at the same time. One could describe it as they were the yolk inside the eggshell, getting tossed around.
A Coast Guard Falcon jet and a helicopter hover over the Satori during the night until the Tamaroa arrives in the morning. Initially, it's thought that a helicopter rescue might be too risky. When the Coast Guard cutter arrives, the Satori captain, Ray Leonard, is still fighting to stay with his ship.
As I understood it, this was his home. He basically lived on board this vessel when it was ashore. All his belongings, everything he owned was on board this vessel, and he was very reluctant to even consider leaving the vessel.
The Tamaroa requests from Coast Guard Command that they declare the sailboat's voyage as manifestly unsafe.
The term manifestly unsafe voyage means that the U.S. Coast Guard has determined that the present voyage of the vessel is no longer safe. There could be a lot of reasons. In this particular case, obviously, the heavy weather and the fact that these people on board were risking their lives by staying on board allowed us to use that authority to tell the master we were going to have to take him off the vessel.
Captain Brudnicki deployed a small inflatable pontoon boat with a crew of 3 to make its way to the Satori. But as it approached, it too was caught in the maelstrom.
A wave picked up the Satori and crashed it down on the bow of the rigid-hull inflatable, our small boat, and punctured the front pontoon of the vessel. So now we had a deflated pontoon, the boat was shipping water, and it was either further damaged, so the chance of us being able to bring that boat back aboard were almost nil at that point.
Captain Brudnicki determined that the only recourse now was to have the crew of the Satori abandon ship and have the helicopter rescue diver attempt to rescue the crew with a hoist basket, one at a time. 25-year-old rescue diver David Moore had trained 3 years for this moment, but nothing in the manuals could have prepared him for this storm. The first challenge was just positioning the helicopter above the waves for the jump.
They have to go up and down with those waves, because if they just stay in one spot, it's 15 feet, then it's up to 65 feet. So a 65-foot fall wouldn't be very pretty.
As Moore gets ready to jump, the adrenaline is pumping.
Ready to go, and kind of pretty excited about the whole thing, as well as sort of apprehensive too, because you're going into this situation that's, pretty hairy, that you've never really been in before. So.
The 3 crew members of the Satori are now in the water waiting for David Moore, but the waves are relentless.
You swing uphill, then you swim downhill. You swim uphill and you swim downhill. And like I said, in order to get your bearings, you'd have to wait till you got up to the top, do a quick look around before you went back down, and get your bearings so you knew which way to go.
Struggling against waves almost 5 stories high, Moore finally reaches the Satori crew.
I approached them. They sort of train you to just identify yourself, to sort of put someone at ease. I think I was quoted as saying, "Hi, I'm Dave Moore, your rescue swimmer." It didn't go quite that casual. It was, I think I said my name, "Hi, I'm Dave, I'm a rescue swimmer, I'm going to help you," something to that effect.
One by one, each person is put in the basket and hoisted into the helicopter. Finally, David Moore is hoisted back up, exhausted. But there's still one more surprise awaiting him.
Well, we were obviously elated. We had helped to rescue 3 people that ultimately may have not survived if we had not been there to assist them. The next big issue was, how do we get our crew, our 3 crew members off the small boat back on board our vessel?
As soon as I started getting undressed, I was heading to get my towel to dry off. So they started motioning at me, waving at me, and then pointing at their ears, basically to come up on the intercom. So I put a headset on to hear what they, see what they wanted, and they said, "Hey, we're not done. We're going to have to rescue the 3 Coast Guard guys."
Only after rescuing all 6 people and returning safely back to the helicopter does Moore have the chance to relax and reflect.
Train day in, day out. But rescues like that are far and few between, and it's right place, right time. And you get to do it successfully, and everything turns out, perfect. And that's a pretty neat thing. And it doesn't always happen for everybody. Like I said, it's right place, right time, and I got lucky there.
The Coast Guard crew of the cutter Tamaroa was relieved that the mission had been so successful, especially under such adverse conditions. Exhausted, they start heading home. But what they don't know is that it's only the beginning of a more fearsome night ahead. Shortly after turning towards shore, Captain Brudnicki receives another Mayday call. It's from the pilot of an Air National Guard rescue helicopter, a message sent only minutes before he's forced to ditch in the Atlantic.
They were about 15 miles from us when they went down. But with those sea conditions, time was the factor, not so much the distance. So we put all 4 engines on the line, and we could barely make 3 knots against the sea.
Against the grueling storm, it takes them 4 hours to cover 15 miles and reach the downed crew, who are struggling desperately to survive in the raging seas of the North Atlantic. On the evening of October 30th, Air National Guard pilot Dave Rivola and his crew of 4 were returning from an aborted rescue mission. These large 860 helicopters are sent on missions that require flying more than 200 miles out to sea. They can refuel en route, hooking up to C-130 tanker planes. Rivola's crew members are co-pilot Graham Bouchard, engineer Jim Mioli, and para-rescuers Rick Smith and John Spillane. Since their flight out, the storm had done something highly unusual. Instead of moving in the traditional direction of west to east, it retrograded, or turned back in towards the coast. Flying back, the crew is surprised to find the weather getting worse instead of better. As they get closer to the mainland, they fly right into a wall of severe weather and turbulence. Running out of gas, Rivola tries repeatedly to hook up with the C-130 to refuel, but fierce winds are making it impossible. Events that night were not documented on video, but Coast Guard training footage gives an idea of what the rescuers were up against.
We were coming up on our air refueling, and the 4th and final air refueling, and the weather started to get really, really bad, beyond anything what I had ever seen.
And the weather just began kicking up tremendously. The turbulence went from moderate to severe. People were throwing up in the aircraft. The turbulence was so great that C-130 itself was buffeting back and forth, you know, rocking and rolling side to side.
After more than 20 failed attempts to hook up with the C-130, Rivola is forced to make the most difficult decision of his career. The helicopter is in serious danger of running out of gas. Should he try to refuel once more with what little time remains? If he fails, they will crash into the Atlantic. Or should he forget another refueling attempt and take the craft down low enough so that his men can jump out of the helicopter, realizing they may perish in the raging seas?
The low-level lights started flashing inside the cockpit, which tell us we had 20 minutes worth of fuel left. And at that point, we were at about 5,000 feet, and you know, I could have continued making attempts, and had I have done that and then, you know, ran out of fuel at 5,000 feet, it would have been a lot more dangerous.
He summed it all up by saying, we're breaking off refueling attempts. We're setting up for planned ditching. And at that time, he took the helicopter down. That was a very courageous decision, I must tell you. When I heard it at the time, I thought, well, that pretty much seals our fate.
Rivola will stay with the helicopter and fly it into the ocean. He knows in these conditions his chances of making it out alive are slim. As he starts the descent, he orders a mayday call.
I did not think we were going to survive the ditching, that we wouldn't be recovered under those conditions. But there was no arguing it. The logic was there. I understood that.
Dave says, we're ditching the helicopter. That means everybody's got to get out. I stood in the door, and you couldn't see anything. The darkness, the depth perception was horrendous. So what I did was I flipped my night vision goggles back down, and then I could immediately see the waves again.
I threw the raft out, and it inflated. I was excited about that. I was like, yeah, I'm just about to go out, and then it disappeared into this void, and not a second thought. I sat back down on the floor of the helicopter, and it's like, oh, no way.
On the other side of the chopper, divers John Spillane and Rick Smith get ready to jump. But they don't have night goggles, and it's impossible to see how far the drop is.
Within a very short time, I'm thinking maybe a minute, we lost our #1 engine. It flamed out due to fuel starvation. So we know we're basically running on fumes at this point, and at that time the pilot called for an immediate bailout. I'm watching Rick, I'm thinking, I want to get with him before he jumps. At least maybe we can stay together on this. And he looks like he's about to jump. He looks like a coiled spring ready to leap from the aircraft. Well, I was able to sit down right next to him before he jumped, and I put my hand on his shoulder, and he then jumped. And I jumped a second or two after that.
John Spillane falls probably 60, 70, maybe 80 feet. All he knows is that suddenly he's in the middle of the Atlantic in a raging storm. He has no idea why. He has no idea how he got there. And he doesn't have any idea who he is.
I fell back to earth. I can remember my arms being in front of me, and those are my last recollections until waking up in the water. I don't remember impact. I remember thinking to myself, this is a long way. This is a very long fall. My next recollection is being in the water, experiencing a lot of pain, and not knowing how I got there.
I found out very quickly that you don't float up and down waves like that. You get about 3/4 of the way up on the big ones, and they break over the top of you. You swallowed a lot of salt water, and you vomited a lot of salt water.
Amazingly, pilot Dave Rivola had been able to extricate himself from the helicopter after it hit the water. Soon, he sees Jim Mioli, who hadn't had time to put on his survival suit and is already suffering from hypothermia. He ties Jim to his own body.
I gave him my hood, and he kept his legs wrapped around me. Little body warmth that he could get from me really wasn't much at all, but he was already shivering by the time he linked up with me.
After several minutes alone in the water and in great pain, John Spillane notices strobe lights in the distance.
And I knew that those strobe lights either were attached to equipment or to my crew members. I thought then that the best thing for me to do would be to try to link up with those strobe lights.
In excruciating pain, it takes Spillane 2 hours to swim to Rivola and Mioli. It would be another 2 hours before they spot the lights of the Coast Guard cutter Tamaroa. Separated from the other three, Graham-Bishore also sees the Tamaroa's lights and starts swimming in its direction. It's early morning, and the 205-foot, 1,600-ton Tamaroa is taking a pounding.
We were rolling considerably. If you think of the mast of the ship, when you roll 55 here, then roll 55 to that side, 110 degrees from side to side. When you're over 55, past 45, it's actually easier to walk on the bulkheads or the walls of the ship than it is to walk on the deck of the ship.
In weather this rough, Captain Brudnicki is concerned about the safety of his own crew, but the crew is psyched.
There was some close bond between us, even though we didn't know them, and not that we would have treated them any differently if they had not been rescuers, but even it's more we've got to try to rescue our own.
They decide to focus in on Graham-Bishore first, since he's alone. They throw a large cargo net over the side for him to grab onto.
He got swept down the opposite side of where I planned on picking him up and got entangled by luck in our cargo net.
And they just pulled me out of the water like a dead fish. I got up to the gunwale, the top rail there, and there must have been like 6 guys grabbing a hold of whatever they could get. One guy got a hold of my hair because they were not about to let me fall back in.
They literally heaved him up and brought him on board the deck. And it was really a moment of exhilaration for sure. And now we've got to focus on the other 3. As luck would have it, the first approach, we brought them up, and as the vessel rolled one more time, they were washed literally right up under the cargo net.
And they had about 8 guys on this net, and they yanked it over. When they got me onto the deck, that's when I found I couldn't walk, and I didn't walk again for a long time.
But Dave Rivola and Jim Mioli weren't so lucky.
And myself and Jim fell off. Again, Jim and I were tied to each other. He was now shivering uncontrollably, and he was even drifting in and out of awareness.
He was like, yelling into my face, "Jim, this is it. You gotta, snap out of it, and this is our last chance."
I said, "Jim, you don't get a second chance alive too many times." I said, "This time when you get on this ladder, you hold on to this with everything you got."
And that, while all of this was going on, Dave never cut himself loose. I mean, that's an incredibly courageous thing.
4 of the crew were now safe on board the Tamaroa, but one was still missing, Rick Smith.
I could not for days get over the fact that I was, in fact, safe, dry, and warm. And I was constantly replaying in my head what must Rick be enduring if he is, in fact, still alive. The cold, the uncertainty.
They say he was one of the best. So we thought if anybody could survive, he could survive. So we started looking for him. And we had anywhere from 8 to 10 aircraft up in the air at any one time, 24 hours a day. And that search lasted for about 8 days, but never found any sign of Rick Smith.
Ultimately, I've come to the conclusion he probably died on impact. I was with Rick when we deployed. We were only a second or 2 apart. From that, I can infer that he probably experienced the same kind of injuries or worse. The one guy who I was closest to, I never saw or heard from, so I think he probably was killed on impact or knocked unconscious and then drowned.
Rick Smith is not the only person the Coast Guard is searching for. The sword fishing boat, the Andrea Gale, and her crew of 6 have not been heard from now for 48 hours. And more ominously, there has not even been a mayday call from Captain Billy Tyne. By November 1st, 1991, the most brutal storm to hit the Northeast in at least 100 years had finally run its course. In its wake, $1.5 billion worth of damage. But more than that, the human toll. After several days of searching, there was still no word from the sword fishing boat, the Andrea Gale. Her captain, Billy Tyne, had last communicated with the fleet near Sable Island, well known to fishermen as the graveyard of the Atlantic.
It's very spooky steaming by there. To know that they probably went down in that area. The boat was never found. Life raft was never found. Bodies were never found in survival suits. Just vanished.
It remains a mystery as to exactly how the 6 men aboard the Andrea Gale met their fate. But given the boat's size, the severity of the storm, and where they are thought to have gone down, marine experts can offer some possible scenarios.
Let's say you're a 70-foot boat in a 70-foot sea, and it just happens that the Andrea Gale is 70 foot, and unfortunately for it, the waves have been estimated at 70 feet. If it gets caught up on an incline of a wave, and the wave is breaking, the breaking peak can actually punch into the back of the transom and push the boat down the wavefront, actually drive the nose of the ship, which is pointed, right down into the trough. It just floods under the ship and pushes the ship right over. And now it is capsized. Now we've discussed pitch bowling, but the real problem with losing control, running with the sea, is broaching. The water's running down past the rudder, so the ship wants to slide sideways coming down the wave. And of course that flowing water makes it worse and snaps you around. Now you can be parallel at the wave at a trough. Pow, it hits you cross side. And that's called broaching when it flips you over. If you put yourself in the wheelhouse of that ship that night, you cannot imagine the hell these people were looking at. They're in waves that are 3 times taller than their wheelhouse. So they are surrounded with black walls of water that they know they could live 10 minutes in.
The names of the Andrea Gale's crew members from Gloucester have been added to a wall at City Hall listing hundreds of local fishermen who have gone down at sea.
It's a big fishing family. All fishermen are connected in some way. So if fishermen are lost, whether you know them or not or how well you know them, you feel it if you're a fisherman.
6 people. 6 people with children and wives and lovers and mothers and fathers. Just totally wiped out, gone. Never see them again in the physical sense, never. Still part of me, right, to this day. Still thinks sometimes, I really do think sometimes, there just might be a phone call, you know?
For all those who fought the storm and lived, their lives will never be the same. Judith Reeves remembers her return.
The first thing I did was I went to the bar and ordered 4 vodka straight up. And after that, I felt a little calmer.
She's married to a Russian sailor, and they have 2 children. She has given up her job with the Canadian fisheries and now sings with a jazz band. Ray Leonard, the captain of the sailboat Satori, spent $14,000 tracking his boat down after the storm until she finally washed up on shore in Maryland with barely a scratch. Captain Larry Brudnicki and Lieutenant Commander Christopher Furtney still serve with the U.S. Coast Guard, and diver Dave Moore is now a firefighter in Marin County, California. Air National Guardsmen Dave Rivola, Graham Bashar, and Jim Mioli are all still on active duty. John Spillane spent 7 more years with the Air National Guard, including a tour in Iraq.
Tommy Zambrano, you got backup?
After 25 years of service, he retired and became a New York City fireman. Married now with 3 children, he is a lieutenant in the fire department and continues to do what he enjoys most.
When you actually go to work to rescue somebody, you have to be able to think on your feet. And I like that challenge, and there's nothing more rewarding than actually being successful in saving somebody.
Back in Gloucester, Massachusetts, fishermen continue to go out to sea in search of the big catch, and perhaps something more as well.
Life at sea can get in your blood, it gets in your veins, and I wouldn't say it's an addiction, but it's something that you long to go back to.
You always miss the fair weather and the beautiful days and the sights that you see out there, which are really, you know, spectacular and mind-boggling oftentimes. It's a majestic place.
The Halloween storm of 1991 will never be forgotten. It has spawned several TV programs, at least 2 books, and even a movie. It is indelibly inscribed in our American seagoing folklore.